box me in.
Are they both here?
Jackie, can I see your pen? Oh, no, I got it.
Ideally, but I also don't have time to wait 2 months, so. Put you on the spot. Did you want to go?
Yeah, no, I have it.
Okay.
Yep. She hasn't said she's going in for her?
I know she was just traveling today. She said she would be where she needs to be by time. But she
Yeah? Okay. Yep.
All right. It is 6:30, so I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. We also have a number of people joining us online, so welcome to those folks as well. We are doing a hybrid event tonight, which is really exciting. Nice to have an audience in front of us. Nice to know there's an audience from across Nova Scotia, actually across Canada. There were lots of registrants there as well. My name's Alex Stratford. I'm the chair of the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing, a political organization here to take on the challenge of poverty. We're delighted to be here today to I don't think celebrate's the right word, but to mark the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Want to acknowledge that the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. The series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 and remain active to this day. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia branch writes that between 1989 and 2019, child poverty rates decreased in every province and territory. However, Nova Scotia has performed the worst in reducing child poverty since 1989. We have the highest rate in Atlantic Canada and the third highest provincial child poverty rate in Canada, which has been a consistent ranking over the last several years. Added to this, of course, is the increasing stress of the rising cost of living and a lack of government action, which is making the matters much worse for many families and individuals and people across this province. We can look at the numbers, and the numbers are important, where, again, we can see a tiny increase or decrease in poverty from 2018 to 2019. Today, there are over 41,000 children living in poverty in Nova Scotia. And in a province as rich as Nova Scotia, in a country as rich as Canada, when poverty exists at those levels, that is a political choice. It does not need to be that way, and tonight we hope to paint a picture of the different choices that we can make. And of course, behind these numbers are real people, parents choosing between paying rent, buying groceries, and heating homes, on top of dealing with precarious employment that puts stress on families and the challenge of engaging in community life through opportunities that, again, make life worthwhile. Poverty has been legislated into existence through chosen policy approaches to social welfare, followed by a refusal to fix social programs that we know are inadequate to bringing families and people above the poverty line. And here's the thing, is that we're consistently told that, oh, there's not enough resources, there's just not enough for us to be able to support everyone in Nova Scotia to live a good quality life. That is a myth that's been created for us. We know that the cost of poverty is $2 billion a year in, again, lost productivity and excessive government services. What that means is that we have the resources in front of us to be able to resolve many of these issues. What we need is different choices. I'm delighted to be here today with all of these panelists who are going to help us paint this picture tonight. This also marks, and we're here tonight to mark the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and also launch a political campaign aimed at raising the political and public discourse around this important and crucial issue, uniting health and social service workers for us to be able to demonstrate that we are united in ending poverty together, and to ultimately have all of the recommendations from the CCPA-NS Child and Family Report Card implemented. I'm happy now to introduce our speakers. Some are in the room, some are joining us online, which again will be, I think, a nice experience in terms of tying us all together. So I'm happy to have Dr. Christine Saunier, the Director for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives here, Dr. Martha Painter, who's the author of Abortion to Abolition, Reproductive Health and Justice in Canada, and Assistant Professor at the University of New Brunswick, is joining us online. Dr. Monica Dutt is a public health medicine specialist and a family doctor at the Ally Centre of Cape Breton. Dr. Dutt will also be joining us online. Ben Sichel is here, who is has been a public school educator for 17 years in the HRM and a founding member of Educators for Social Justice, one of the coalition members sponsoring this event, as is Dr. Christine Saunier with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I'm happy that Lana McLean is joining us today. Lana is a registered practicing clinical social worker with over 30 years of experience working in the fields of addiction, mental health, and trauma. Jackie Barkley is here, who's a longtime community activist who's worked in the front line of social work, delivering therapy for over 30 years, including at the Nova Scotia Hospital and the IWK. I'm happy that Morgan Manser is able to join us, who's a staff lawyer with Nova Scotia Legal Aid, practicing in child protection and family law. Amy Moonshadow is joining us today, who's the chair of the Community Advocate Network, and Crystal Hill, who's the Indigenous social worker with Nova Scotia Legal Aid. Thank you all for joining us and for discussing this really important topic with us tonight. We are going to have a series of questions that are going to be posed to the panelists tonight. We're going to try and work through those and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. If we don't have time, we do have some space here that you're welcome to come and ask some questions with, but we do have to be out of the library by 9, so we're going to work towards those goals as best we can. So I'm happy to start us off with a question to Amy. Amy, why should Nova Scotians care about poverty, and what impact does poverty have on the quality of life for a person?
Okay. Worry is a circle of inefficient thoughts going around a point of fear. Chances are, when you live in poverty, there is a lot to be afraid of. Fear always is of not having your needs met. In these uncertain times, a threat of homelessness is always looming. Fear is not having control of your destiny because a system has been designed to enforce your poverty. That fear is paralyzing sometimes. Folks like me with an invisible disability that have lived on income assistance in Nova Scotia are always in a deficit position, both emotionally and financially. The stress is never having quite enough. I have had competitive employment years ago, and so my big return of contributions is an income of $41.08 a month from the Canada Pension Plan. Now, rumor had it when you reached the mature age of 65 and a guaranteed income and old age security kicked in, all would be well. Not for me, not yet. I paid for mail forwarding, but still the paperwork that would secure my future got lost in the mail. Now, having been poor for so long, I have come to expect glitches like this, and so I always have a month in advance squirreled away, you know, money in my mattress. However, the rent, heat, lights, and internet phone bill are recurring expenses, and come November 1st, they'll have to be paid. So, after 201 minutes on hold, an agent of Service Canada Pensions Department gave me 10 minutes of her time to tell me I should have used the online services in March after my 64th birthday in July of last year to make my application. The usual time to process is 150 days, 5 months. But given my circumstance of not having any income since June, she would see what could be done to expedite the process. And so I got a call tomorrow or the next day. Just maybe there will be some information about payments coming for me. But if nothing is coming before October 31st to pay my November rent, I hope a Halloween witch can wave a wand, maybe pull a rabbit out of a hat, and the $1,200 to meet my basic expenses will be met.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing. Again, just how deep a hole it is to just meet basic needs and necessities. Lana, I want to come to you. There's a common narrative in many places of the world, including here in Nova Scotia, that poverty is a personal choice, that anyone who works hard and picks themselves up by their bootstraps will be rewarded. Given the legacies of enslavement, colonization, and intergenerational trauma, why is that narrative so broken and so problematic?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question, Alex. And Amy, thank you for sharing your story with us today. It's the story of many people that I have the privilege of working with who struggle. First of all, it's not the narrative is broken, Alex. The narrative is completely false. It's erroneous. I think when we look at the bootstraps, we need to ask the question of whose boots are we wearing? How were those boots made structurally? Are they wearing like $5 sneakers or the $250 Nike Airs? So people's bootstraps are always fragile. So I think the narrative, again, is false and not broken. And when we look at the issues of intergenerational trauma, colonialism, racism, particularly in our disadvantaged or our equity-seeking community groups, particularly for me, the African Nova Scotian community, the narrative doesn't even speak truth to the amount of labor, free labor, people of African Nova Scotian descent has given to this particular province in the building of this country. It hasn't given voice to the names and to the communities across this country, our Indigenous community, our new Canadian community, who are keeping this economy actually going right now. So they're the folks who are actually the bootstraps that we are all actually pulling and tugging on, and are being the ones who are actually fracturing them. So I would say the narrative speaks only to the narrative of those of us who have privilege. And most of those of us who have privilege usually have a position of power. I'm a social worker right to the bone, so let's talk about privilege and power and how that operationalizes to maintain the inadequacies of the system. It keeps some of us working and making money. I make money off the pain of people. I'm a social worker. If there wasn't poverty, and as a Christian, I always remind myself that, the Bible says the poor will always be with us. They will always be with us, but it also then means how do we question our humanity as people in terms of what are we doing to change systems? What are we doing to do the social action work? The work that marginalized communities have been struggling for and have been silenced by predominantly the, to my left, Jackie, I would say the Marxist ways of thinking. But in terms of how does capitalism maintain the status quo? It works, and it works for a certain demographic. And to give up privilege and power would then mean looking at equity. And I think when we look at intergenerational trauma and issues of colonialism, the system was never meant to welcome me or welcome people who look like me into that process. So even if I'm a middle-class Black woman, I'm still working a job and a half just to build back some legacy. The laboring is constant, so there's no break. So I just would like to say one more time, the impacts for, even those of us who are university educated, we are probably the first, if not the second generations in our family who are reaping some benefits, but reaping them at a psychological cost, a spiritual cost, and a financial cost to our families and to our communities. But we do the labor anyway, and we do the labor because it's in the best interest of the communities that we serve. So again, whose bootstraps are we pulling up on? It's usually those that are at the bottom. We are more than willing to look at blaming and shaming, which only impacts people's psychological wellness negatively, and that the issues of racism and colonialism and anti-Black racism and trauma, all as Amy was saying, the traumatic experiences of being in poverty intergenerationally, and then we still want to blame the victim. So I leave you with that.
Yeah, thanks for putting that into context for us, Lana. I think that is what is lost on many people, is that our system is intentionally set up to maintain poverty in order for that privilege to be maintained as well. That, again, is a choice that we've continually made as a society to entrench that. And again, this is the important narrative that we want to deliver, is that we can make a different choice. Crystal, I want to come to you next. We've been exposed over the last number of years to the harsh truths of colonialism in Canada and the reality of it. With the legacy of residential schools, the continuation into the 60s scoop, into the millennial scoop. And of course, when we look at the Child and Family Report Card, it's very obvious that it is First Nations who suffer in deep poverty at this moment in time. Can you tell us a little bit about the impacts of colonization and its relationship to poverty?
Well, as an Indigenous woman growing up here, I'm a direct descendant of residential schools, so that residential school impacted my grandmother, which impacted how she mothered my mother, which impacted how my mother mothered me. So I am the first person, and Lana mentioned this when she spoke, the first person in my family to have a university degree, which was very unusual for Indigenous people. And without a degree, the opportunities for employment for Indigenous people are very limited. The mere survival of getting through each month, each day, takes a priority over education, over progressing in employment opportunities. So colonialism has impacted generations. We as Indigenous people helped build Canada and welcome the Europeans to Canada to grow this beautiful country that we all live in. And but it was at a high, high cost of lifestyle, of language, of culture. And all of those things were not valued. When I was a child, we didn't tell people, if we could get away from it, that we were Indigenous, because it wasn't something you told people. Some people didn't have the privilege of not sharing that because your name would indicate who you were. So as a child growing up, there wasn't a level of pride. I go out into communities now, and I tell you, it's prideful to be Indigenous today. My grandchildren have a level of pride that never was afforded to me or my children, because my children are now in their 30s and 40s. So, but now the generation that's coming ahead, they have a level of pride, they stand tall, and they will move mountains and do well in life. But poverty is in our communities very heavily. I see it with the folks that I work with that are involved in child protection issues, that when maybe something happens, a domestic happens, and their children are removed from the home, when they lose their child tax credit, then their housing becomes precarious, then poverty, and then it just is a snowball effect that people, when their housing is compromised, it's hard to get stable on your feet and be in a place where you can reunite your family. And I see that over and over and over again. And people who live throughout the province, throughout Canada, when people live on First Nations communities, programs are underfunded. There's not enough service providers that are offering service to families. Housing is inadequate. My goodness, it's hard to believe that we have communities in Canada where there's not fresh drinking water. I think that's outrageous that in our world today, that in Canada here, we have communities where there's not fresh drinking water. If that happened in Halifax, that would be taken care of in a very efficient way. But because it's on reserve land, it doesn't get attended to like others because it's not seen as a priority. We need to put all people level of poverty above, increase, elevate people so they want to do better, elevate people so they can do better, set them up for success rather than setting them up for failure or setting them up to be dependent on the systems. So like Lana said, we have jobs. We're fortunate, we have jobs, but not all of our people have jobs. And a vast majority of our folks are living in dire poverty. And I just think that it's outrageous, and that at the same time, I see the level of resilience in people that can speak and advocate on their own behalf and be a strong voice for those who can't. Because many of people who are living in poverty just don't have the power and strength to speak on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Appreciate it. Again, what I really appreciate about your story too is that the hope that you painted as well, with the resurgence and momentum behind self-governance and reconciliation. It's important that as we come out of tonight that we hold on to that hope of what kind of world we could build and could have. I'm going to ask, did we get Dr. Dutt? We did. Excellent. Okay. I'm going to come to Monica next, so we're going to try out the big talking head behind us here. Welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us. I'm glad you got on line. Dr. Dutt, political rhetoric around healthcare from all sides of the political spectrum generally pays a lot of lip service to the social determinants of health. Can you tell us why the social determinants of health are so vital for our well-being?
Sure, I just want to check my volume. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Yes, we got you.
That's working? Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. Yes, Alec knows I had very badly timed travel, and I just actually got off a flight from Halifax to Toronto and rushed to my computer in Ontario rather than being with you. So I'm sorry not to be there in person. But with this question, I work both as a family doctor and a medical officer of health. But with this question, I think about so many of the patients I see in clinic. And in fact, kind of anybody who comes with any health issue, we can think of it in terms of this context of social determinants of health, which is, a fancy way of saying, if you haven't heard the term before, that essentially the conditions that we work in, live in, play in every day shape our health. And we often tend to focus healthcare discussions, including in Nova Scotia, we tend to focus discussions about health on healthcare and healthcare access, although absolutely essential, is only one part of what contributes to our health, and actually often a smaller percentage than the many other conditions that surround us. And I was thinking of one person in particular, not identifying anyone, but a woman in her late 20s, and she lives in kind of horrendous housing in Cape Breton, and her stove and her oven don't work. She can't afford a microwave. Her shower doesn't work. There's mold in her house. Her toilet stopped working, and she has a lot of trouble finding any other social housing that will take her because she has a dog, and her dog is the center of her life, and she very understandably will not go anywhere without her, her family member. And she's in tears every time I see her. And she knows, and I know, that if she lived in housing that gave her dignity with her dog, her health would drastically improve. Her mental health, the respiratory issues like asthma that she has with the mold in her house. And, she's an extreme situation, but with any health condition, we know that every condition in some way is affected by poverty, by lack of access to food, by your education, your income, your immigration status. If you can't pay for fresh food, you're not going to have a healthy diet. If you work multiple jobs, you probably have little time to, go out for a walk or physical activity. If you've had trauma through your childhood, you're much more likely to use substances in a way that might be harmful. And kind of even more deeply than that, as people have already, I think, really eloquently talked about, these differences in access to good health, it's not accidental that many of these differences in health are shaped by structural factors like racism, capitalism, colonialism, and they put people on these paths towards poor health, no matter what kind of individual decisions they may try to make through their days. And so truly we need to recognize that there is kind of oppression built into so many policies that are in place right now. And also, as been said, we have the ability to change that, and policymakers have the ability to change that. So I think this panel is really important to talk about health as a political issue, because that politics shapes and often determines the health that so many people experience.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we've heard this current government consistently talk about fixing healthcare from a point of the interaction between a practitioner and a patient. What we've yet to hear are those robust social factors that contribute to well-being and allow somebody to live a quality life as well as a healthy life. So I wanted to come to Dr. Painter next and ask, why do you think governments are so resistant to meaningful policy change to impact the social determinants of health?
Thank you, Alec, and good to see everybody. It's good to see you, Monica. I think the short answer to this, Alec, is the election cycle, right? These are issues that we cannot resolve in 4 years, and so they are not appealing to run on the kinds of changes that we need to make, and that's the root of it. That there needs to be this fundamental investment in what really matters to people, and that investment just isn't attractive, isn't sexy for an election cycle. And we see these kind of announcements that really almost worsen the problem, often by creating one-time, short-term, project-foced funding bonuses that don't really do anything foundational to shift what we're looking at. So what we really need is for just an admitting, an acknowledgement, and acceptance that the fundamental root of it all is changing people's purchasing power, changing that foundational experience of adequate income, and not these tiny little piecemeal non-solutions that that we hear about. Sorry, my daughter is trying to show me that she ate her lasagna. Good job, you ate your lasagna. You can go play now. Sorry. Yeah. So I'm really concerned, especially when we make investments in healthcare that displace the investments that need to be made on the ground, because it's all really fundamentally from one public purse. And when we make these investments that inevitably will make our lives, our professional lives, more challenging, because that money has been displaced. And so from a professional ethics, from really a pragmatic perspective, we need to be supporting, as health professionals, we need to be supporting those upstream shifts that we know need to change. But there's a realism to it. We have to be supportive. And that's where I find we often fall short, that we know about, or at least we've heard about, the structural determinants of health as healthcare professionals, but as a force, an incredibly powerful workforce, unionized force, we may fail to get behind the kind of support for anti-poverty change that really needs to happen if we actually want our professional work to be simpler and more successful. My daughter's asking a question. What's your question?
No, you got us there for sure. The resistance to delivering on the social determinants of health. But it was a really nice segue, Dr. Painter, and into the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is in the failure of government and of government policy to meet the social determinants of health. You and Dr. Dutt have outlined, again, the impact on patients that we see. So again, of the day-to-day delivery of healthcare of a nurse, and I know that broad spectrums that nurses work within, but how does poverty impact that day-to-day of delivering core healthcare services, and particularly the services that nurses deliver?
So I think everybody's familiar that my work is in abortion care. And so, you know, it's one thing for abortion care to be publicly covered. You come to our clinic, or you come to the pharmacy to pick up your medication abortion prescription, and that is covered. There's no cost for that. So great, that's fantastic. Obviously we need that. That's, you know, a bare minimum. But then you go home, and what are you going home to? And so for those of us who are working in the reproductive justice movement, who are really committed and understand that reproductive autonomy is really the first step to democratic participation in our society, if you want somebody to get to experience reproductive autonomy, you can't stop at their publicly funded abortion. That's really the bare minimum for them to have human rights. What's happening in terms of their nutrition, so that when they want to be pregnant and have a wanted kid, Is that pregnancy healthy? Are they even eating enough to have a healthy pregnancy? Are they able to escape? Abortion is an essential escape from domestic violence, essential. But could you leave? Can you afford to leave? Not in this one crisis moment when you're pregnant, but like in general. Can you leave? Once you have those children, can you take care of them? Can you get them to where they need to go? Let alone the acute health emergencies that children experience. And children are very prone to these kind of things, to injuries and ingestions and respiratory illnesses and infections. Do you have the means to get the help that you need, the process, the trip to get there? Yeah, once you get to the hospital, the care is free. But what about all the steps along the way? And what about just having healthy kids who are well-fed, who are outdoors, who are supervised, who are given the opportunities to experience the health of leisure and play and recreation? Those are all they're fundamental things to reproductive autonomy, to being able to choose your family size. So it's not just about having that publicly funded abortion, which of course is essential. I think the most immediate thing we encounter as people in this care is, the abortion, that is covered. But the contraception that you need immediately after is not. We have these arbitrary, really deeply sexist, colonial, racist ideas about what gets to count and what doesn't get to count. And there's one example that, before I was ever a nurse, I was trained as a health economist. And this is just one of those what? What are you talking about? That we could pay for an abortion as a system every week of the year, but we won't pay for your birth control pills. We've made this decision about what we value and who we value. And it just communicates that if you are too poor to afford the $30 a month for a birth control pill, we don't value you. That's what that communicates. The way our system has made decisions about who gets to count and who doesn't. Your reproductive autonomy counts if you have Blue Cross, if you have a great job and you have private insurance, then you get to matter. And otherwise you don't. And that is a blow. I think we are very high and mighty about the way we are different from, for instance, the terror in the United States right now, the threats against reproductive liberation. But we haven't been adequately self-conscious about the ways that we restrict people based entirely on income, on poverty, from just getting to govern their own bodies.
I think many of us share that sentiment that it really makes no logical sense at all what we choose to pay for and not pay for as a public system, knowing full well that if people had adequate income, if people had quality housing, if people had real choices, that the stress on our healthcare system would look totally different than it does at this very moment. And I want to stick with that a little bit as I come back to Dr. Dutt and ask, why should all physicians in this province and across Canada be fighting to eradicate poverty?
I was thinking about this question quite a bit and how to kind of frame an answer. I think one kind of straightforward answer is that, as physicians and many clinicians, we diagnose conditions, we try to see causes of what contributes to that condition and do what it's in our scope to kind of improve that condition. And if we are seeing that poverty is a cause of what is harming our patients, what is harming their health, it is something that we should be looking at. And at the same time, I did want to put in the caveat that as someone who's part of public health, part of healthcare, like any institution, we are often part of systems, sometimes knowingly, sometimes inadvertently, that do perpetuate violence, do perpetuate poor health by the way we have individual interactions with people. And there have been some very horrific public examples of that with Joyce Echaquan in Quebec, Brian Sinclair in Winnipeg. And we are part of those systems, both in those individual interactions and with rules and systems that we just work in every day, that we may not even think about the fact that they harm people's health. And another aspect is, I think sometimes, physicians are sometimes given this privilege in society. And I think there is also a risk of physician advocacy, I think sometimes centering the physician to the exclusion of the voices of people who I do think really need to be heard on issues, who may be the ones who are most experiencing the poverty or other kind of types of oppression that do need to change. So all that to say that I do think anyone who is especially part of any kind of harmful system needs to take the time to look at their own position, their own biases, and try to dismantle those systems. But I also think it's incredibly important to take a lead from communities, lead from community organizers, especially around anti-poverty efforts. And I kind of, in terms of practical aspects of this, I think healthcare providers and physicians, there's a number of ways we can be more active in terms of anti-poverty work within our kind of individual interactions with the individual patient level. There's examples that come up daily that we can be connecting people with services, we can be connecting people with other team members in healthcare who, sometimes are far better positioned to be able to support needs that will help to alleviate poverty, help to help people navigate systems. We can also be looking at the community level, where are we in terms of working with community organizations that are often doing incredibly strong and unfunded and often really hard work to change the conditions within our communities to try to improve levels of poverty. And, I live in Cape Breton, and we have, extremely high, like in much of Nova Scotia, levels of child poverty, of family poverty. And then there's that bigger policy level where I think, health professionals can have a really key role, as Martha was talking about, very specific examples from reproductive justice. And so I was thinking of another example that's come up in the last, many years, but there's been a push in the last few weeks around migrant justice and status for all, because knowing that permanent resident status, without that immigration status, it's a determinant of health. It's a contributor to poverty when you cannot access services because you are undocumented or you lack permanent status. And so it's led often by migrant rights groups and the Migrant Rights Network, and they did make an ask that they wanted a health provider voice. And so many health providers across the country have come together to support that campaign. And I think that's an example of physicians and other health providers being able to support a community-led movement to improve health, to decrease poverty in a particular group and community. And that's the type of advocacy I think is really important for physicians and others to be part of.
Yeah, I think it's only when we're able to come together and demand that change, at all levels, that we'll see it unfold. And I certainly appreciate, ties into Lana's point at the beginning of this talk tonight, that again, our entire society is built on the labor, particularly of the most marginalized and vulnerable. And in Nova Scotia, particularly with our large agricultural section, we are bringing in large forces of migrant workers and then denying them basic health care in many situations. And this contributes, again, to the broader stress in other areas of our systems, which is also a nice segue as we move to talk about the connection with poverty and child welfare. Again, as much as poverty impacts our health care, there are upstream factors as well that are contributing to that stress on that system that we're all talking about politically, particularly the provision of child welfare. So Morgan, I'm going to come to you. And as a lawyer with legal aid, you provide legal services to many child welfare clients. Can you tell us about the impact that poverty has on the administration of child welfare in this province?
Of course. Thank you for the question, Alec. So child protection is highly correlated and caused by living in poverty. The vast majority of all families involved in the child protection system live in poverty. And the system disproportionately impacts racialized families, as many folks have spoken about. And so when we see things like food and housing insecurity, that can bring folks directly into the system. But the inaccessibility of services, both prior to and during families' involvement in the child protection process, creates real challenges for folks. So often we don't have a proactive preventative system, and then folks have often we are seeing removal of children, which has a lifelong impact on folks. And we see that intergenerational trauma that so many folks are talking about. And we see that across generations. So many of my clients, their parents or their grandparents were involved within the child protection system. And a lot of folks have an inability to meaningfully engage and participate in the process because of living in poverty. So many folks, per se, wouldn't have access to Wi-Fi. And then to sort of receive an email from their lawyer, which contains all of the court documents that they need to meaningfully participate, they have to go somewhere, either to the library or to Tim Hortons, in order to read those documents. Many folks, a lot of our court proceedings continue to be over the phone. Well, a lot of folks may not have the minutes on their phone to be able to call in or to have a meeting with their lawyer prior to. So they have real significant challenges in terms of meaningfully engaging within that process. And, you know, Amy spoke about earlier the real emotional toll and stress that living in poverty has on folks. And then they're brought into the child protection system, and the law is a very blunt instrument. And so we have a system that is very cold. It is not compassionate or empathetic to folks, and it is not a trauma-informed process. So it exacerbates that for many parents and many families. And that's really, really challenging for folks. And as Lana spoke about earlier, we have a system where all of the decision makers, the social workers, the lawyers, the judges, are middle-class individuals who have very limited lived experience of living in poverty and or being from racialized or equity-seeking communities. And therefore, often they're ill-equipped in order to really be understanding what it means to be living in poverty, the impacts that that has on someone's ability to really alleviate any concerns there may be.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, we don't have good data in Nova Scotia, surprise, surprise, that connects the issue of poverty with child welfare. We do in other jurisdictions where, again, it's starting to look like almost 60% of families engaged with child welfare are there for socioeconomic reasons, issues of poverty. Again, as a system that is completely under stress on a daily basis, anyone who works in it understands the stress load. The fact that we can alleviate much of that stress by significantly tackling poverty seems to be lost on many of our government decision makers in terms of where we could land and how we could make that system better. But Jackie, I want to continue this conversation in child welfare with you. You know, you work closely with folks like Morgan, but with the clients to, again, build family reunification. So can you tell us a little bit about, you know, continuing on from where Morgan built the scenario for us there, the challenges of reunifying a family with this ever-looming tension and conflict of poverty that many families involved in the system will be facing?
So in many cases, it's It's almost impossible, straight up. So I'll repeat briefly some of the things that I think that Crystal and Morgan have talked about briefly, which is straight up. I mean, if you don't have a phone, if you can't get to the visits with your child, if you have a job where you're working minimum wage, it's highly unlikely that they're going to give you time off to arrange visits. If you don't do the visits, you will be seen as uncooperative and uninterested in reunifying your family. If you don't have the money to buy food at the moment, which is extraordinarily high, to bring appropriate snacks for your children. I mean, this is the mundane, day-to-day horror of being someone in the child protection system. And it's really important, I think, that we not, that we be really clear that people involved in the child protection system have challenges. I mean, they've made judgments or been involved in situations in which the state intervenes to take your children or to threaten to take your children. It really doesn't get a whole lot worse than that. So I'm not trying to idealize the people who are involved in the child protection system. What I'm trying to say is that the stated goals of reunifying the family won't occur if we are not supporting people to actually be able to feel capable of having agency in their own lives, whether they are women who've been abused, whether they are racialized families who've been treated to horrific treatment by the police, or all kinds of things going on in their families. So, but I kind of want to move a bit from that specificity, though it's important for every one of us here to understand how brutal that specificity is. I think I want to ask the question about some theoretical concepts that make involvement in child protection and reunification with the family in relation to poverty a real difficulty. And that is the question of medicalizing social problems. So today, I get a phone call from a child protection worker who says, do you do psychological assessments? And I don't. But I know that they cost somewhere in the vicinity of $4,000 to $5,000. So I said to the frontline child protection worker, like, why would you be doing a psychological assessment in the case of this particular parent who is an abuser of his children's mother? And he said, well, because the court ordered it. So I said, okay, the court has ordered a $4,000 psychological assessment, the last paragraph of which at the conclusion will say, this is a person with a personality disorder who's exceedingly selfish and violent and who needs CBT and perhaps some DBT to change his behavior. So even inside the system, we have processes that reinforce the medicalization of what is essentially a violent patriarchal attitude toward his spouse that needs to be challenged in counseling. I don't mean that persons exhibiting those behaviors can't change. I just mean that it requires probably less than a $4,000 expenditure on a psychological assessment than it does the services that would help his partner to make choices so that she doesn't have to go back to him, and B, that would really make the idea of changing a particular behavior possible. So the reality is that trauma-informed practice is actually about, in 90% of cases, trauma is as a result of either patriarchy, economic oppression, racism, enslavement, or colonialism. But those are actually the things that cause the day-to-day trauma that people wind up having to go to therapists to work through. If, however, we are constantly medicalizing the obscure psychological individualism of people's private problems, we actually aren't able to help them get agency in their lives. So I think that that's a really serious question, what we mean by trauma-informed and what we mean by an entire system that individualizes the experience of the person so that there is no examination of the systemic issues. And I think Cindy Blastock is a hero who has addressed those issues in many ways for all of us. But I want to make one more comment, and that is about this question we've been talking about this evening, about how the question of poverty is a political choice. So I think that all of us in this room really need to reflect on what that means. Does it mean big P political or small p political? So there really, in my experience, are only three ways that huge systems change. One of them is on the street. One of them is through constant education and lobbying. No, I'm not supposed to use the word lobby. Reminding politicians of what the actual conditions are, advocating, doing petitions, et cetera, et cetera. Also, so the street's important. The processes of education is important. But what we really haven't talked about is the big P political. I'm afraid that many of our organizations, particularly in the nonprofit area or in the professional area, we are attached to neutrality in the political system. So the words that have not yet been used tonight are the NDP, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the election of probably an individual closer to populist fascism as the new leader of the federal Conservative Party. Like, we actually have large P political structures that need to be addressed. And so one of the things we want to ask ourselves, if we don't want 8 more years of what gutted the infrastructure of social service delivery systems during the Harper era, if we don't want that to happen again, we need to take to the street. We need to educate and do petitions and go to all of our political leaders. But we also need to make very clear decisions about who we want to lead us politically in the electoral system. So that's my challenge tonight. We've got a couple of years to prepare, and I think that neutrality has got to be challenged, because then we never actually speak openly about, I think there was a statement made tonight about all sides of the political spectrum. Don't think all sides of the political spectrum respond the same way to poverty. And so we need to take responsibility to reflect on how we are actually going to organize ourselves, our neighbors, the people in our professional organizations, the people that we work with in our institutions, to say that challenging poverty is a political act. The existence of poverty is a political choice, but the challenge of that is a political act, and none of us can lead tonight, and hopefully the thousands of other people who are going to see this after tonight can leave without asking, which political action am I going to choose to engage in to deal with this issue?
Yeah, that's crucially important, Jackie. Thank you for raising that. And part of our goal tonight is to recognize that our systems currently are not neutral. They are political. And oftentimes that political narrative is that sustains poverty for all sorts of reasons, whether we're not making choices to bring our social safety net up to where it needs to be, to just not acting at all. Even, again, how we structure the delivery of our healthcare, those are political decisions. And so it is crucial that we hold on to Jackie's point as we move out of this night and into action, that holding a political position and taking political action, and there's many forms of that as Jackie has articulated, is what is going to be crucial for us to push the needle on this issue. Now, Jackie's taking us a little bit off track, but I appreciate that, because Jackie's good at that. I do want to pull us back a little bit more to continue to talk about child welfare, and then I'm going to come to Morgan and then back to you, Jackie, to talk about some political action that we've got going outside right now, which Jackie can talk about. But I want to come back to Morgan, continuing on the topic of child welfare, particularly, again, the Children and Family Services Act, which was amended in 2017. And at the time, the Minister of Community Services said we needed those amendments in order to be more preventative. Has that worked?
The short answer is no. There were significant changes when the act was amended in 2017. And one of the things that it did was it changed the definitions of risks to children. And what that has meant is now there are more families involved in the child protection system today than there were in 2017 or 2016. And so that has meant the budget hasn't changed. So now there's less money for services per family. And one thing that's really important in the child protection legislation is that there's very strict timelines. It recognizes that children's sense of time is different than adults. And so therefore, there's a very limited amount of time that folks and families have to remedy the concerns that brought them into the child protection process. And so there's an inaccessibility of services. It certainly is not more preventative. And now we're seeing even those who were involved in the court process are having significant difficulty in accessing services, both community-based services and those provided by the Department of Community Services. So most parents are required to do two things out of the gate, and that's participate in parenting education and participate in individual counseling. Well, parenting education is always a 3 to 6 month wait to get that started. And so the clock doesn't stop ticking because that service is unavailable to that family. And the same goes for the counseling piece. Unfortunately, there are very few therapists or counselors who are doing that work. And Jackie's one of the few who continues to do that work, but they deserve to be fairly compensated for that work, because we are benefiting from the free labor of those folks who are doing the really challenging work. But the real problem is that a lot of the trauma that folks have experienced is deep-rooted, and it takes a long time for folks to be able to work through some of the challenges that they have. And so sometimes when we're talking about the policy piece, policies can make a very meaningful difference. So the enhanced Canada Child Benefit has made, a substantial, meaningful difference. Is it enough in and of itself? Of course not. But one of the challenges we see are when children are removed from a family, they take away the Canada Child Benefit. So that can put their housing at risk. And also, they need to participate in services, so they need to attend those services, they need to attend counseling, parenting education, access visits with their children, they need to bring healthy snacks, and therefore, they don't have the income in order to do that. In order to address the concerns. And that puts tremendous stress and strain on them when they're trying to often remedy mental health or substance use concerns. And so we're actually exacerbating it. And then what happens is often, rightfully, the children are returned to them because they have done enough work. But it takes many months for the Canada Child Benefit to be reinstated for folks. So then the child is back in their care, and those monies are intended to benefit the child, but it's many months before they can feel that impact. But the parent obviously already has to pay for everything that the child needs. And there can be extracurriculars and uniforms for sports, or the extra their cost of food and so forth, and they're not supported in that. So already we're setting them up for failure, which can also mean that, you know, it's cyclical and they could come back into the system in months or years. And that's ultimately not what we want to see. And I think folks would probably be shocked at the amount of money that this costs us as taxpayers. The amount of money that is not put into prevention. Well, I understand that was the intention. That is not what's happening. There's less services before intervention and less services after intervention. And that costs us all. And it would be much, much cheaper if we invest you know, preemptively in providing folks services so they don't have to come in and see folks like me, which is very costly.
Yeah, it really is mind-boggling sometimes when, you know, everyone up here tonight certainly sees these policy decisions being made and can't quite understand why no one else can see these connections here. It's very frustrating. The child tax benefit is a really crucial example of this, where, again, one government that administrates the child tax benefit, the federal government, and the provincial government, which, again, takes this when a child is brought into care, cannot effectively or efficiently work together to ensure that it does not harm the family's reunification process, or again, the overall well-being of the parents and the families in that regard. And this happens in many different settings. You can look at, we know, unfortunately, that many children who are in foster care, there is an unfortunate pipeline into the criminal justice system. Again, even from a fiscal standpoint, to keep a federal inmate in prison for a year costs $100,000. Imagine, again, repositioning that fiscal balance in a way that was truly preventative. Now, Jackie, I want to come back to you to talk about that child tax benefit, and particularly the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition's continued work to make this connection for the various levels of government.
Yes, so honestly, it's incredibly discouraging. It is such a straightforward process. It's an amount of money that is supposed to be attached to the number of children that you have to assist with all the care of the children, including housing, including transportation, et cetera. And when that money is removed from people who don't have enough to live on to begin with, their standard of living actually drops quite dramatically during the very period that they are supposed to be working for the reunification of their family. I think Morgan's already spoken about this very eloquently, and I appreciate that. Those are the details of what happens. It's horrific. But what I want to add is the concept of fear. So the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition has been together about 4 years, 5 years. We can't, it's hard to keep track. But it's a group of people who've been working for a really long time to try to raise issues of people involved in the child protection system. What's really important to know is that being involved in the child protection system is frightening. It's a really fearful process. Even if people have made bad judgments and made bad decisions, all of their efforts going to have their children returned make them afraid. And so this is a group of people that has enormous difficulty advocating independently. Not because people in the child protection system don't have viewpoints or ideas or opinions or the desire to exercise their citizenship, but because they're afraid. They're afraid often because they know they've made mistakes. They've tried to change those mistakes. They've tried to really reorganize their lives. They are not the people who are going to call their MLA or their MP or the press or the media or their child protection worker and say, give me my money. Like, they are not in a position to do that. And so I think I'm talking here about the mental health issue that's connected to agency. when you're involved in the child protection system and you're working really, really hard, and I think many of us in this room have probably done things in our lives that we think, I should change that behavior. You know, I should change that. And even small behaviors that many of us have tried to change take an enormous amount of work and energy, an enormous amount of fear of failure, and an enormous amount of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So what Morgan has described is at precisely the moment that perhaps through the work of the lawyer, of the client, of all of the system may be actually coming together appropriately for a child to be returned, that is the moment that people don't get their money back. It's at that very moment when they need all the resources, all the confidence, all the agency, all the strength to advocate for themselves that they can't. So, no one should leave tonight without signing the petition. The provincial and federal governments argue with each other repeatedly about whose fault this is. Peter Duke, who I think is a lawyer in this room and a hardworking member of the coalition, understands all of the technical issues very clearly. It does not have to be this way. It is not a requirement of Revenue Canada to have it occur the way the province of Nova Scotia is doing it. And for 5 years, we've been talking about this publicly. It is not a complicated, small problem change. So poverty, a big, huge, complicated problem. Yeah. Returning the child tax benefit, easy.
It's the lowest hanging fruit that no government has seemed to respond to at this point in time. Doesn't cost any more money. The money's there. Just make it work.
Yeah. So everybody, please
sign the petition. So again, this carrying through, we've talked a lot about mental health, and of course, it's intersecting with poverty. We again have built systems that tend to medicalize mental health, but again, don't look at the social context that contributes to, mental health disorders and overall mental distress. So Lana, I want to come to you and ask for you to really lay out the complexity of mental health care and its interrelation to poverty, and again, how poverty impacts trauma and vice versa.
Thanks again, Alec. So it's as simple as what we've been talking about this evening, and everyone's weaving through all these themes together. So here's what I see. So I work in a healthcare setting, and so someone comes in who's insecurely housed, so they're homeless. So after 3 months of 2-3 weeks of a stay in a hospital setting, for example, they've got food coming every day. They're safe. They're not concerned about certain things. We're dealing with any of their anxieties that are presenting with their medical concerns. And then we say, guess what? It's time to be discharged. So we're discharging you from a very safe, reasonable, kind, caring environment back into a community setting in which then we are then amplifying your anxiety again. So you just got some psychological safety built in, and then we're preparing you to go back only to re-traumatize you back into the system where your access to healthcare, your access to medications, your access to supports and services are become very precarious. And then, we just re-trigger and re-traumatize everything over again. So from a healthcare perspective and from a mental health perspective, we give you a moment of psychological rest only to re-traumatize you when we send you back into the community, because the things that you're preoccupied with that are causing you anxiety is, I got to go back to the shelter. Am I safe again? I already have a history of trauma. I'm now being re-triggered, or there's certain prompts in those environments. So poverty, particularly in Nova Scotia right now, and the level of insecure housing, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of resources, the financial amount of money that people have coming in when they're on fixed income. And I would say this is across generation. So the young person who's homeless, experiencing trauma or had trauma experiences, whether it's in their home of origin or another event, who's been struggling with their mental health through addictions, got into a safe place, got into a recovery program, then we're sending them back out and we don't have any place to send them. So they're going maybe back to, if they're lucky, into a group home setting that might be available in the community where they're around. In our world, we say people, places, and things that re-traumatize and re-trigger your substance use. So there's this vicious circle around poverty, regardless of the age. Today, I worked with a 75-year-old man who was reno-evicted, and now he has severe COP and cardiomyopathy, and he's like, well, where do I go when I leave here? And I'm like, I have to call Welcome Housing to help you to go back into a hotel, or advocate for a hotel stay back with that. His anxiety just amplified it up again. So those issues, regardless of where you are on the continuum of life, insecurities, wealth disparities have all contributed to mental health, wellness, and I'm not talking about the severe and persistent mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. I'm talking about everyone's vulnerability in this room, because they say 3 in 5 Canadians have anxiety experiences at some point in our lives. So I'm just talking some of the basic things about how we actually show up in our lives and try to manage. Now, add issues of race, add issues of gender, add issues of ability to those particular things, and then we look at our mental health becoming much more vulnerable. So I'm no longer, if I can get housing and I'm an African Nova Scotian, well then maybe you're not the person who's the right fit for that housing at that point and at that place. So that impacts on your mental health, and you may seem, people say black folks get really defensive when we're loud. And actually, we're really big on self-advocating when we have the advocacy around us. So all of a sudden, my ability to advocate for myself when I'm loud and boisterous, I call passion, is seen as if I'm being disruptive, and is seen as if I have an anger control or anger management problem. And this is what I see in the child welfare system, is now all these folks, when they are standing up for themselves, are considered, oh, I'm not safe. The social worker or the person's like, I'm not safe. Well, this person's never been safe. That's the other, so even though we speak trauma-informed lenses from our different organizational perspective, we tend to traumatize people even sometimes with our desire to do good. So what I would say, Alex, how people see mental health and poverty and how they kind of intersect, and they're like that game of teeter-totter. There's no real sweet spot. The sweet spot is when we actually do and provide people with affordable living, when we give people access to resources, when we actually deconstruct and confront patriarchy, colonialism, anti-black racism in its everydayness. Pardon? Oh, yes. I got a sister in the room who's giving a fist bump. Thank you for that. When we recognize that people's lives are complicated, and when we're willing to recognize, can we just sit with someone and hear the story and hold the story without being judgmental and without activating people? Because as a society, what we tend to do is give that level of false hope, and or we are becoming quite complicit and compliant with the way in which the things are becoming status quo. Yeah, there's 40 people in the emergency department. Oh, well, that's our new norm. When we should be advocating for different ways of engaging folks. I'm a big advocate for, programs like the North End Community Health Centers, where you have access to resources and real people in real time, interdisciplinary teams, people in their communities. And I know I'm going to the solution thing, but I'll pull back. But in terms of the question, Alex,
we're going to get there.
the intersectionality is that there's Maslow's hierarchy of need. If I don't have a home, if I don't have my belly full, how can I pay attention to what the therapist is asking me to do? I am just distracted by other things in my life, and there's a higher priority of things. And for people of African Nova Scotian descent, it's the basics that we need to have some stability on in order for me to enter into those therapeutic relationships, and feeling that I even can trust the person I'm sitting across the room with to even speak about some of the psychological harms that I've endured over my lifetime. So I think, you know, poverty, intergenerational poverty, the access to resources and people to do the work, but also how the system can perpetuate those harms. Not necessarily like that we're consciously doing it, some of it's unintentional, because we don't have the community-based resources that we used to be able to provide those interventions and preventions to. I just want to give a shout out to the Mi'kmaq community and the work they're doing around the prevention and prevention initiative with reformulating child welfare from an indigenous lens and with lots of intention, and to actually do that with the level of intention that our Mi'kmaq community is doing through the MKK initiative has been, for me, a very privileged part of a process to revamp, to redo, and to make in prevention the priority versus the protection. So, because we have to remember, children live in families. And if we're going to treat children and protect children and mitigate risk to children, we also have an accountability around the inverse of that, is to protect families and the parents or the people or the carers who are trying to provide supports and services in a timely, culturally reflective manner. And that's a lot to ask, but it's doable.
Yeah, I want to, Jackie, bring you into that point as well in terms of, again, that when we're talking about mental health, particularly the mental health of families, to which you're doing a lot of work with, again, that what would the eradication of poverty mean in that setting when you're doing that mental health work?
You know, that question is so huge.
Mm-hmm.
I actually can't wrap my brain
See, that's
around.
why I was giving it to you, because I thought you could unpack it for us.
Perhaps my age, being around a long time, I would be so happy if just one or two of the actual problems people were dealing with, and so I'm not diminishing the bold idea of eradication of poverty and its impact on mental illness. I would just be so happy if people weren't being evicted, or if they weren't waiting for a year for a family doctor, or if they could just afford a place to live that wasn't mold infested. And I'm really not mocking the big idea. I think the eradication of poverty would probably throw a lot of us out of a job, which would be great. We just would need so damn many lawyers and therapists and whatever, who make a lot of money, as Lana said earlier. We make money from poverty. It's really important. And it's a very complicated and twisted issue. But yeah, right now, Alec, I would just be glad if people got their money back when the child was returned to the family. Mm-hmm. And if they got, if instead of, building some of the giant places that are in my neighborhood that are being built, the federal and provincial governments got back into building housing. Mm-hmm. Those things, I think, would create a vast improvement in the mental health of the people I work with.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jackie, because yes, we are here to mark the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. That does feel, in many cases, like it's unattainable or far away from us. But many of the little actions that you described there, the ones that really aren't that much to ask in our society, are the steps that we need to be taking to get us there. And I think that that is the conversation that we need to have coming out of tonight, is those political actions. Now, you're seeing throughout the night, those of you who are in the room with us, a list of demands that we know are well researched. Christine is going to talk about them in a moment. I'm going to give Ben some space first. That we know will have a substantial impact. This is the type of political momentum and action that we're hoping to build out of tonight, so that that big hope and dream, go for it.
I just want to tell a tiny little story that I think is connected to so much of what's been talked about tonight. Sometimes I worked at the Dartmouth General Hospital with Lana, and there was a lot of hourly wage that was being paid to me to not say yes. What I mean by that is, if all somebody needed was a taxi chit, they were quite prepared to pay an entire hourly salary to a master's level social work to find 26 ways of saying to the client, no, you can't have a taxi chit. Yeah. That's pretty expensive institutionalization of poverty.
If I could just pick up before we go to Ben, because one of the things that over COVID has taught us that we can do anything when we put our minds to it. But the COVID checks that people received who are on income assistance, the amount of trauma and drama that has impacted on low-income people when they got their taxes or had to do their taxes and realized that's a taxable amount of money, and the amount of money they have lost, or the income that they can no longer, their GST, some of the ways in which they were budgeting. So if we're going to give money, can we just make it a non-taxable money to folks, instead of telling them in a way in which, for some folks, for the first time, having some kind of reasonable wage or living and reasonable ability to have food, and then we backstab people by saying, now that you've done your taxes, you now meet the gap in which you are no longer considered poor. And now we're going to ask you, you can't have your GST, or you have to pay us back, and then you're not eligible for certain things. And the amount of psychological trauma that has caused for low-income people in this province and across this country, that has, significantly impacted on people's issues around homelessness and food insecurity, is unbelievable. So if, one of those social justice actions is, if we're going to be willing to do that as a COVID response, then the response should not be attached to my, and to my wages. It should just be, here's your money.
And the amount of resources we put into clawing that money back from already poor people is also frightening. Ben, happy to come to you now. I am, and I know everyone else knows the impact of poverty on children. As an educator, what impact does poverty have in the classroom?
So thanks, and I have to point out that I can't believe that you put me on a panel with all these smart people who do like research and policy analysis, and then you make me speak after them. So, so thanks for that. I'm glad Christine is still. I'm glad Christine is still on deck here. But it's good because I use, I like to read and use all those policy analysis when I'm arguing for things. So what does poverty look like in the classroom? I mean, there's things that feel kind of cliche by now, at least to me, or at least if you've thought about this for a while. So kids who haven't eaten or haven't eaten properly, don't have access to good food, kids without, good coats in the winter or adequate clothing, school supplies. And then there's things that are maybe less obvious, but which have been touched on a lot tonight. Just the anxiety and stress in households that live with poverty, and how that, how children live with that, and they bring that with them when they come to school. Not having access to things like dental care or adequate mental health care. Maybe parents or guardians aren't around to help with homework because they're doing shift work. Maybe kids don't have a quiet place to do homework at night or adequate technology to get it done. Really, I think what I wanted to emphasize is that we all, pretty much 100% of us, almost 100% of us have a lot of experience with schools. Like we can imagine, we can remember very vividly what our school life was like, at least at some point. We spent many, many years there. And nowadays, as adults, we hear about schools in the news for various reasons. And when you hear about education stories in the news, in pretty much any circumstance, we need to look at every story through the lens of poverty and child and family poverty. So, for example, if we're hearing about children's reading scores or math scores going down, well, of course, those test scores correlate with household income. So you have to look at how, we're worried because Nova Scotia's fallen behind Alberta or Ontario or whatever. Well, look at our poverty rates and see why that is happening and see how lifting kids out of poverty will help those test scores, which are problematic in themselves. But anyway, if we want to improve the scores, if you want to improve kids' academic achievement, obviously they have to have their core Maslow needs met. And as a bonus, they get to not be miserable. If you're hearing about things that we've heard about a lot in the last couple of years, online learning, air quality, COVID in schools, well, COVID, of course, had a hugely disproportionate effect as well on people who live in poverty. When you think about which kids had parents who were working in grocery stores, working as CCAs, working as early childhood educators, who were on the front lines, who were much more likely to contract COVID, that had an effect on kids. Which families are the ones who are getting pursued by the federal government to repay their CERB? While companies, of course, who took the wage subsidy, of course, never had a problem and continued to pay out dividends to shareholders. And similarly as well, when we hear about labor issues that have happened in our schools recently, so right now, we have educational assistants in the Valley and here in HRM who are negotiating, who are on the verge of strikes. Or if you hear about how more and more is constantly getting added onto teachers' plates, or how class sizes are swelling, or substitute teachers are in short supply. Well, educators are trying to fill in those gaps in a lot of cases for the kids, whether they're emotional gaps or, again, cliche, but a very true one about feeding kids granola bars off the side of the desk when they need one. It's hard enough to do regular teaching jobs, to do all those extra things that we are trying to do, and then trying to address those emotional gaps and those gaps that kids face because of poverty as well. Well, that becomes harder as well when we have trouble in our workplace, because our kids' learning conditions, as we know, are our teachers' working conditions. So it can be very discouraging for educators. I worked until recently. I spent 15 years working in a school in Dartmouth, and in recent years there was a huge initiative there to start a food bank, and it took off in a really big way, and some local business stepped in to support it, and it even expanded to an occasional hot lunch program, and it was considered a huge success. It got media attention, and it happened thanks to, in large part, a group of maybe 3 or 4 teachers who put a lot of time, a lot of volunteer labor, did a lot of organizing, fundraising, getting kids involved, and I'm very proud of those teachers. I'm very proud of that school, and at the same time, I'm horrified that we have to have a food bank in a school. When we talk about those workload issues, like it affects a lot of extracurricular activities. We just feel that we can't do anymore as teachers, and so it seems just not right that my extracurricular activity would have to be making sure that kids can eat. Like the kids should just be able to eat, and I should be able to coach the basketball team or whatever. As we've heard, these are all choices, right? Poverty is a political choice. It's a choice to cut corporate taxes by $80 million, as the previous government did. It's a choice to spend billions on fossil fuel subsidies and to leave childcare workers and CCAs living in poverty. So it needs to be a conscious choice that we make to fulfill these recommendations that Christine is going to talk about, I think, in order to eradicate poverty. So I want to try to dream big. I know it's hard, but you know, on a good day, what's the sentence? On a quiet day, you can hear her breathing, right? Who said that? Nobody knows? Somebody's got to know that quote. Arundhati Roy, I think it was. A better world is possible. Anyway, somebody Google it and get back to me.
Ben, just before you put the microphone down, again, you clearly are a teacher who understands, again, the complexities and the social context in which your students are coming into the classroom. What would be your pitch to other teachers? Why should they care about poverty?
Thanks, yeah, and I've thought about that a little bit because I do try to make the pitch to teachers sometimes, and I asked some other teachers before I came here, I was like, what would you say? And they said, you know, we're compassionate people, we want people to kids to do well, and that's true, you know, we want one teacher said, students are missing wonderful aspects of their future lives because they don't have the same advantages. I mean, for me, it's because, you know, no one is free until we're all free, that I just want people to be able to have the things that they need. And that is the case for many teachers. You know, teachers are compassionate people. They like children. You can't really be in the job for very long if you don't like children. I've seen people try. It doesn't go very well. But if that's, you know, if that's not your jam, if you don't really, if that doesn't get you, you should care because it'll make your job easier. And you know, we know, of course, you talk about the $2 billion cost of poverty, that eradicating poverty is a big money saver in the long run. And you know, if you want to get into a what's the word I'm looking for? From political strategy, if we're going into, you know, collective bargaining because teachers want to raise, well, it looks good for teachers to care about poverty. You know, that's very kind of, I don't like thinking about it that way, but I've tried to think about how to get through to many people in different ways, right? I think the best way we can do this is collectively. Someone else has mentioned how much our unions need to do, and our union leadership, the teachers' union leadership, has been much more vocal recently in talking about child poverty, and so I'm proud of that. And we need to use that collective power that we have, those of us who are lucky enough to be unionized workers, to move the needle on these kinds of issues and to help. You know, unions look out for the welfare of their members, of course, but unions also need to understand how the welfare of our members is tied into the welfare of everyone around us and that of our kids.
Yeah, thank you so much for articulating that. Again, the narrative, if we haven't been clear, is that this is a political choice. Everyone can be making a different one and acting in different ways. I'm really happy to be able to have Dr. Saunier wrap up our discussion tonight. As one of the principal authors of the Child and Family Report Card, Dr. Saunier has provided us with a roadmap on how we need to get there. So what should government be doing, and why is there an urgency for us to act?
Thanks. You know, I don't think I can add anything qualitatively to what we've heard tonight about the second question, the urgency to act. We've heard from our frontline service providers that people aren't just struggling, they're suffering. We've heard from Amy what that suffering looks like. I thank our frontline service providers for their dedication and their commitment and for doing all you can in a system that is designed to function this way. It isn't broken. But what I will add is a bit of quantitative and sort of general global approach, and then end with what's been flashing on the screen all night. Poverty is bad first and foremost because people are struggling. People are suffering in our community, but that's bad for us. It's bad for all of us. It's bad for our communities. We all lose out when so many amongst us can't reach their potential, and when so many who can't reach their potential are children living in poverty. We know that lasting impact is for generations. You know, I think about that commitment that was made in the House of Commons to end child poverty by the year 2000. Imagine. That would be a whole generation of children that we would have lifted up. Imagine if they'd done it quicker, since they made that promise back in the 80s. We live in a country, in fact, right now, where the probability that a child in the current generation will remain in poverty has actually increased and now stands at 33%. That means 1 in 3 of those children who are living in poverty today likely won't be lifted up, unless, of course, we make dramatic change. The current government approach to poverty is disastrous, but it is designed that way and is part of an approach that these governments have been in and boxed into for 30 years. Every single government has not gotten out of the box of the trickle-down theory, a market fundamentalist approach that has said that government needs to get out of the way, we need to shrink it, we just are going to grow the economy and everybody's going to do better. And if you don't do better and you can't take the opportunity that's presented to you, then it's your fault. You just need to have more income in your pocket, and that'll trickle down. Despite all of the evidence of what has been shared about that individualized approach, the bootstrap approach, the trickle-down theory has been a trickle up. It's been about those at the top. The story of poverty is a story of income inequality. It's a story of the sponges at the top. What the evidence is showing us is that poverty and unequal living conditions are the consequence of poor social policies and programs, unfair systems and structures, including economic, but not only, and political decisions. In fact, government, as we've been underlining, can make different choices, and I want to underline just how stark it is that they can. Nova Scotia's gross domestic product is $40 billion in this province. Please, I don't ever want to hear that this province is poor. That's what we produced in 2021. Canada is the 8th wealthiest country in the world, producing $6.2 trillion in 2021. That's $43,000 per person in this country. We have 43 billionaires, a complete policy design. That, in and of itself, $1 billion, okay, here's an illustration of what that means, because we just listened to these numbers and what do they mean? $1 billion means making $1 every second for 32 years. Does anybody need $1 billion? 524 Canadians have $100 million or more in wealth. 12,000 Canadians have 10 million or more. Imagine if we shared the wealth. Imagine if we valued something more than GDP. These numbers, where we only value what can be counted and added to the wealth, include things that are destructive to us, to our environment, but they don't include things like the care that we're all talking about. I saw a number the other day, caregiving labor in Nova Scotia, wait for it. Unpaid caregivers spend 221 million hours providing care each year in this province. If we value that at, say, $20, that's $4.4 billion that we aren't counting. That is not even valued. Imagine if we centered care, work that doesn't have a significant carbon imprint, that is about providing the wraparound services that we've heard about that's so needed tonight. That economic transformation must go hand in hand with government making different choices and taking a principled approach to what kind of province we live in. One where we ensure that people's basic needs are met instead of continuing down the same path where the same people are rewarded and the rest are supposed to fight over the crumbs. As Alec outlined in the beginning, we have calculated the cost of that approach, and it is significant. What would those different choices look like if we pushed our governments to make them? Our government takes in $3 billion in personal income tax, another $2 billion in sales tax, but only $535 million in corporate tax. Is everyone really paying their fair share? Looks like some are paying way more than their fair share. You don't go to the grocery store and pay a different tax if you earn less, right? That is a flat tax that we all pay. And when we look at the share of that tax in this province, those at the top pay on average a very similar share to those at the bottom. An unfair system. We have seen taxation reform benefit the top and benefit corporations. What we need is taxation reform as part of this package so that we can ensure that we can collectively provide for everyone's essential needs. Taxation's our original crowdfunding, and it is absolutely the most efficient way that we can pool our resources and do what we need to do to take care of each other. We have mapped out a plan for enacting housing. We worked with community organizations from across this province who are, again, doing what they need to and what they can to provide housing in this province. Housing as a human right, imagine if that was the approach taken. Ensuring every Nova Scotian has access, and that means tens of thousands of affordable housing that is outside of this market, that is cooperative, that is nonprofit, that is social and public. That's what we need. Government, in fact, needs to ensure that there are non-income, non-market-based solutions to the high costs of other essentials. That includes expanding universal programs, ensuring people pay less out of pocket for health care, making childcare and public transportation more accessible and affordable, if not free. Invest in supporting local, sustainable, affordable food production and distribution. Invest and let's make post-secondary education free. While governments work toward that goal, they need to reduce tuition and allow people to get access to education and upskilling without taking on the debt that is so burdening our current generations and the previous generation. Solutions need to address both sides of that gap, both the costs and the income. We can't just tackle one without the other. The Nova Scotia government must fulfill their obligation to directly provide more income benefits to those in need. We've clearly heard that underlined again and again. Our government knows what the poverty line is, how much people need, and they decide to give them less. We know that is what is trapping people, how ungenerous the support is, not being able to afford a roof, not being able to have enough to support for basics, being expected to afford the bootstraps. We have this really handy tax credit. It's called the Affordable Living Tax Credit. Imagine if we made that actually work. A decision that could be made tomorrow would be to increase the support into that vehicle and actually make life more affordable. Some things don't even have a direct cost to government. How about that minimum wage and the labor laws that have absolutely favored our employers and our bosses and our corporate owners for decades? It's time to substantially raise it. Do you know, by the time that our government's plan to bring in the $15 minimum wage, which is April 1st, 2024, minimum wage is going to go up $15. If we do the calculation on what's been happening in terms of inflation, that 15, it's going to be worth $10.44 by April 2024. It's time for a $20 minimum wage. It's well past time for us to ensure that everyone understands what we've heard tonight. Who is to blame? Who needs to take responsibility for the 100,000 plus people, including children, who are being made to struggle and suffer in this province every day? Our neighbors. I'm going to end there.
That is a way to end. Thank you. Now, folks tonight have laid out the impact of poverty on the delivery of services across services in Nova Scotia, the impact that it has, and the recklessness of allowing poverty to fester in Nova Scotia. One of the actions for tonight is that we can change the tide. We can change those political choices, but only when we act collectively. So Amy, I want to come back to you to help us close out the night and to give us a call to action. So before I go into the details of the campaign we're launching, I want to come to you and to say, if you could sit down with the Premier and his cabinet at this very moment, what would you say to them in terms of the political choices that they need to make?
Okay, my call to action. Ideally, all Nova Scotians would have a livable, guaranteed basic income, using the social determinants of health as a guide to determine the amount. But the process of transforming our tax system is slow. I am asking our Premier, the Cabinet, and other people of influence in Nova Scotia to be more aware of what it feels like for individuals that rely on the employment support and income assistance programs. Myself and other First Voice recipients and their allies have been giving officials of the government direction for 20+ years. And so my question is, why do folks still feel traumatized and terrorized by a broken system? The answer is easy. Redistribute the wealth. We have to end legislated poverty. If we don't give the issue of legislated poverty voice now, we are weakening democracy. The COVID and climate process of late have shown that the government can act quickly and provide to people based on need without being stigmatized. Oh well, Christmas is coming and the middle class can indulge themselves by helping the less fortunate. Well, with my white gift, I want some assurance that the donor understands there is something more they can do by connecting with agencies like the Canadian Mental Health Association, North End Community Health Center, Parent Resource Centers, Affordable Housing Association, Healthy Minds Co-op, Association of Black Social Workers, Elizabeth Fry Society, Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Centers, Shabukto Connections, St. Vincent de Paul Society, Brunswick Street Mission, Acorn. Well, thank you. This event has been sponsored by the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing, an umbrella organization that can provide insight and direction. So, just ask.
Thanks for setting us up, Amy, for that. So tonight we are launching a new campaign. I see that I'll come to you in 1 second, okay? Tonight we're launching a new campaign. You've heard a broad array of health and social service professionals tonight tell their story of the impact of poverty on the delivery of their services. What we need to be able to do is to elevate that. We have a website, Poverty is a Political Choice. We are inviting all professionals and all people in Nova Scotia to log in, share their story, so that we can make it clear that allowing poverty to fester in Nova Scotia is no longer the political choice that we need to make, and we want to make a different one. We demand that we make a different one. Log in, share your story. On that website, as well as an opportunity to, if you are a professional, write to your professional association, enlist them in this fight. They are your voice. They can make sure that they are connecting it with the right people. Finally, engage your decision maker. Let them know that you are no longer, that you are demanding that we end poverty. Again, on the website is an opportunity for you to do that and to connect in that way. And finally, we need to elevate and share this campaign. So with your neighbors, with your community, with your colleagues, Let them know that poverty is a political choice and that we demand to make a different one. To aid you in that task, there are, of course, the petition that Jackie was talking about outside on the table to sign, as well as postcards that you can use and take. I have more to help spread the word of this campaign. Today, we are around 50 people in this room. I believe we probably have about 100 online. That is more than enough to build a movement to effect change. When Tommy Douglas first envisioned public health care, he sat around the table with six other individuals and mapped out how they were going to do it. Just 6. We have close to 150 in this room tonight. That is more than enough to build a movement and the momentum for change that we want to and need to see. I am going to, Vicki, did you want to? Sure. Yeah, Vicki gets the last.
Because I'm Vicki. Okay. For those of you who are not aware, we talked a lot about poverty. One thing you may not know is that in this country, medical assistance in dying is now open to every Canadian with a disability. They want to include, this isn't there yet, but they want to include people with mental health issues like depression, which I also have, and children 12 and up can now decide, if the government gets their way, can now decide to kill themselves. So all they have to do is go to a doctor and say, hello, I'd like to die, and the doctor goes, okay, and has them sign a piece of paper. As of right now, people who look like me are choosing to die because they don't have the things they need to live. Thousands of people who look like me are now dead at the hands of our government and government inaction. If this had been an option for me 10 years ago, I would not be here today. My people are dying at the hands of my government, and it is being viewed as compassionate, and no one is fighting for us. Every day, thousands of Canadians are dying, and no one seems to care. So yes, we have to end poverty, and one way we can do that, if we do that, we can save not only the lives of the people we've discussed tonight, but the people with disabilities who, quote, choose to end their lives because they have no choice. What we are experiencing now is a social and social and politically motivated genocide. The destruction of my people is happening every day. Every day in the story, in the news, I hear another young woman who looks like me is dead because she couldn't get health care or housing. Please, for the love of God, help us before more of us die. Talk to your politicians, explain that this genocide will not be tolerated. This genocide is not what Canada is about. So not only are we going to not expand the practice, but we are going to stop it before more innocent people have to die. Thank you very much.
Vicki, thank you for that incredibly passionate and heartfelt statement as to why we must act and why we must act now. We have a call to action, folks. We hope that you'll join us in this call to action, lift these demands up, engage. Only collectively can we change the political choices that we are making. We are going to end there for tonight. I do want to give a big shout out to May and Corinne, who have been offering ALS services for us. Thank you. And thanks for everyone who came out tonight. I know our panelists are going to be here for a little bit, not too long, so please come up and ask us some questions. For those online, apologies we didn't have time for more questions. If you have any for the panelists, feel free to write to us, and we'll make sure that those get out and answered for you. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and have a really great evening. Thank you.